Please be advised that this serving of AIDS, the Lost Voices, may cause offense or upset, as
we read newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s with individual stories of children living with HIV/AIDS. In some newspaper articles, the parents may share details of the latter stages of AIDS and the period leading up to their child's death, which some may find upsetting.
AIDS brings a response
Fight
from the
against
government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
welcome to Extra Tea with your camp host, William Hampson.
And my fabulous co-host, Gloria.
Between us, we'll be looking back through the decades at how Britain reported on the AIDS pandemic.
And where we will try to unpick individual stories in the newspaper archives from the 80s, 90s and noughties.
Ready?
Ready?
All right, let's do it. Hey, Will.
Hey Gloria, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks for asking.
Awesome. I was on your socials earlier, reading many lovely comments about the series. One that caught my eye was from Martin Butler, OBE. He said, fast becoming essential listening.
I know, right? And I'm not somebody who does compliments in everyday life, but I read it and I thought, oh, that's really nice. It's a nice thing to say, because it's quite nice to know that we're doing okay at something. But once I saw the name Martin Butler OBE, I just was like, oh, it fell off my chair. Because, I mean, this is a stupid thing that I'm going to say, but if anybody doesn't know who Martin Butler OBE is, then you need your medal for gay history revoking.
I agree.
Because he was a co-founder of the Terence Higgins Trust. Now, this is the HIV charity that's still around and has been around since the early 80s, because not only was Martin there at the time, he was also friends with the late Terence Higgins, who sadly passed away in the early 80s at the start of the pandemic from HIV/AIDS.
We should do a shout out to Martin. Martin, if you're listening.
Gloria, control yourself. It's not that kind of show. But, Martin, if you're listening, OBE, I don't know, do we have to bow now or curtsy? Or so we're doing a little curtsy. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, gosh, I can't get back up. Right. Okay, so now the pudding is back in the bowl. I'm not even sure if that's the same. I just made that up as I went along. Shall we get started?
Let's do it. The first article we are looking at is The People newspaper on May 21st, 1989. It's a front page story with the headline, AIDS split my tragic tiny twins.
And there is a large photograph of twin girls sitting in what looks like a bathtub.
Yes, and the strapline reads, Kim okay, but Carrie has her mom's virus. And the article reads, twins Kim and Carrie Muir are divided by a deadly secret. For while 3-year-old Kim is normal, her little sister is doomed to die of AIDS.
Oh, and I know we say this all the time, but the language, to quote, Kim is normal and her little sister is doomed. The press can't even muster a little more sympathy, even when it's children. Oh, it's just...
It's not nice, is it?
No, it's horrendous.
I agree. The article continues, the twins' mother, 25-year-old Irene Muir of Edinburgh, is a former drug addict who is herself dying from AIDS.
She passed it on to Kerry through her bloodstream while she was pregnant. A leading gynecologist said last night, this is an amazingly unusual case. It could be that each baby grew on a different placenta in the womb, and so one escaped being infected.
So, to clarify, despite the girls being twins, only one has been diagnosed with AIDS.
That's right, but sadly, the article shares it doesn't end there, as the article goes on to say, it's a triple nightmare for Irene, for not only are she and Kerry dying of AIDS, so too is her 26-year-old boyfriend David, though he isn't the twins' father. Irene is already pale and tired as the virus takes its toll, and time is running out for Kerry too.
No, it doesn't sound good, does it?
Sadly, it doesn't, does it? And it's hard to decipher if the journalist, in this case Meg Milne, is perhaps just painting an accurate picture, or if she's merely hamming it up to make it a more sensational story. And it is surprising to me for a front page tabloid that's got a massive photograph taking up the whole page that they didn't label this as an exclusive, as they usually are accustomed to, given the manner in which she articulates the article. It's very sensationalist, isn't it? It's very doom and gloom.
Yes, I hate to admit it, but the article has me gripped.
I totally get where you're coming from, because these tabloids newspapers, when they sensationalize stories like this, they're very clever at drawing you in. You know, we want to know what happens. We want to know what happens next.
Go on and continue so we can learn what happened next.
On that note, I'll continue. For while Kim thrives, her sister hasn't put on any weight for 6 months. She has to go through the ordeal of fortnightly visits to the hospital for painful blood cell injections. At her Edinburgh Council flat yesterday, Irene told her horrifying story.
When I got pregnant, I didn't know I had the virus. Like every other mum, I had all the normal tests. It was only when I had another test the day before the twins were born that I was told that I had the HIV virus and would develop AIDS. I was told both the twins would be the same. I was put in a ward on my own, and they even had a delivery room set aside just for me, with all the staff wearing special gowns and masks. It was terrifying. 6 days after the babies were born, a doctor walked in and confirmed my worst fears. He said, "You and the twins are all HIV positive." But as the weeks went by, the doctors began to think that one of the babies might not have the virus after all. Yet it wasn't until they were 14 months old that I was told that Kim was clear. She is really blooming now. Kerry has not been putting on weight for 6 months. I have to take her to hospital every 2 weeks for 2-hour intravenous injections of blood cells. Kerry cries when they stick the needles into her and Kim cries for her. I just keep remembering it's me who took the drugs and infected myself. So why should she have to suffer so much?
Irene has nothing but praise for boyfriend David, another ex-junkie.
He isn't the twins' father, but he loves them as if he was,
said Irene.
There is no way their real father would care for them. He wasn't on drugs, and he's even told me that I have killed Kerry because of my drug habits before she was born. And I know what he says is true.
Irene added,
I've made a will to make sure my mother gets the twins if I die before Kerry. I know Kim would be adopted, but no one would want Kerry. She'd be put in a home and die alone.
A leading gynaecologist said last night, one explanation for one twin having the virus and the other not could be that each baby grew on a different placenta. A case of this kind must be extremely rare.
What an incredibly sad story. Do we know what happened to the family next?
Well, the article clearly paints just a single picture that the family are all doomed, as the article states, and each family member, with the exception of Kim, who's not HIV positive, are all staring imminent death in the face. That's about the size of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I spent an incredibly long time in the official Scottish records, but very quickly discovered quite early on that Irene had used her maiden name, Muir, for the purpose of the article.
That's
now, this is
interesting.
quite smart of Irene, but it's quite telling of the time, 1989, that she's obviously a little bit concerned about the fear, ignorance and stigma around HIV/AIDS, that she's using her maiden name.
Yeah.
Although there's a small inset photograph of Irene's face and one of her partner, David, smiling, and the big picture on the front page of the twins. But perhaps, it was just a small step that she could take to try and protect herself and her family. But searching the records, I came to a very interesting dead end, because the science says that a child born with HIV left untreated generally dies at a faster rate than adults, and this is usually between 1 to 2 years old. So it was incredibly surprising that I couldn't find a death certificate for the HIV positive twin, Kerry.
Does that mean that if there is no death certificate that...
Yes, exactly. We're thinking along the same lines here, because I couldn't find a death certificate for Kerry, either under her mother's maiden name, which is used here in the newspaper, or under her actual birth surname, because I found her birth certificate from 1989 when this article was published, right up until recently 2019. And I couldn't find a death certificate for Kerry because she's still alive today.
Wow.
I found Kim and Kerry across social media platforms. I found the twins. But the good news is that Kerry, despite the picture that's painted here in the People newspaper article, Kerry is still thriving today and enjoying life, which is absolutely amazing.
This is so nice to hear, especially as the article stated, time is running out for Kerry.
I know, right? And the journalist's kind of views and opinions to one side, Kerry's mother, Irene, says that she's not putting on weight, she appears to be unwell, but also that she's having to take Kerry for these 2-hour intravenous blood cells transfusions. And I assume this is to keep Kerry's immune system boosted.
Yeah.
And I've been able to find no information in regards to this treatment for children. But what I did find was that on the UNAIDS website, along with many other sources, they say that children born with HIV very rarely make it beyond 2 years old.
Really?
And Kerry is showing signs of looking unwell already at 3 years old.
So there was no medication for HIV in 1989?
Well, there was a medication that was called AZT from 1987, and this was prescribed on the NHS here in the UK. But it is widely reported that adults couldn't tolerate the side effects, and I've spoken to many people that are living with HIV today that were diagnosed back in the mid to late 80s that used AZT and said it was absolutely horrendous, and many of them came off AZT. So it makes you wonder, if an adult couldn't tolerate the side effects, would a child be able to tolerate the side effects? And a lot of people reported that it made them unwell. I'm not sure if AZT was something that they would consider in regards to treating children with HIV/AIDS. But it was 1996 when antiretroviral therapy became widely available here in the UK.
Was it possible Carrie was able to start art 10 years after being born with the virus?
I'm thinking the same thing, because when you've got the UNAIDS saying that it's very rare that a child born with HIV lives beyond the age of 1 or 2 with no treatment, but maybe this cell transfusion that Carrie's mother Irene talks about in the newspaper article is a form of treatment that is keeping her immune system boosted so that she can hang on to when art becomes available.
Especially when the article says Carrie is looking unwell at the age of 3.
I kind of wouldn't listen to anything the journalist says, because I think the journalist is just going to sensationalise the story, but there's no escaping that Carrie's mother Irene does mention that she's unwell, that she's not putting on weight. But is this anything to do with her HIV/AIDS diagnosis? Or is this, something that many other children experience, in the early years? Another underlying health condition that's preventing her from putting on any weight. But I think it's amazing that between 1989, when this article goes out, to 1996, when art therapy becomes available, that Carrie is really strong enough to cling on until a more effective treatment comes along. So it would be interesting to find out more about these blood cell transfusions that Irene's talking about, because I couldn't find much on the internet.
So if Carrie is thriving today, does that mean her mother Irene and stepfather David are also thriving?
Well, sadly, I couldn't find out what happened to David, given the article makes no mention of his surname for me to be able to look him up and trace him. And if I was to search under deaths for David, you can imagine every year there's thousands of Davids that passed away in Scotland. But as for the twins' mother Irene, she lived for a while before she sadly passes away on New Year's Eve in 1996.
Is there any explanation as to how Irene passed on New Year's Eve?
I've ordered the death certificate, which will obviously explain Irene's cause of death, but Scotland are a little bit slower at processing the certificates from their records offices than in England. So I haven't received it yet, but it should be in the post anytime soon, so hopefully I'll be able to update the blog post. And I did reach out to Carrie.
I was going to ask if you'd reached out to the twins.
I reached out to both the twins via Facebook, and in the case of Carrie, I messaged her on several Facebook profiles that she's created this year alone, so I suspect it might be some time, if at all, that I'd get a response. She perhaps leads a very busy life, shall we say, but the main thing is she looks to be doing very well and seems to be enjoying life. I mean, really, when you look back at the article from the People newspaper that, had Carrie down as being on death's door and about to, sadly pass away, the fact that she's still alive today is absolutely amazing.
Yes, and a very different outcome to what the reporter portrayed in her article.
Yeah, no doubt Carrie was unwell at the time of the article, but it goes to show you should never believe everything you read in the newspapers.
Yeah.
And before we move on to the next story, I wish to send a massive thank you to Emma, who kindly voiced Irene's story. Now, Emma may be a voice you've heard before, as she's been on TV, radio, and in endless newspapers and magazines as an HIV advocate and activist. And like Irene, Emma is Scottish.
Really?
Yes, really. Living with HIV, and she is a mother of 2 little ones.
Awesome.
And you can find out more about Emma and her work on Instagram at @positivemum2. So thank you, Emma.
This next story was also reported on News at 10 on April 10th, 1985. Let's take a listen.
The health department has urged people not to be afraid of having blood transfusions after the death of a baby from the killer AIDS virus. The reassurance follows a verdict of misadventure on 20-month-old Antony Thorpe, who died in a London hospital after receiving blood in America. The statement says the chances of getting AIDS through transfusions in Britain are extremely remote.
The baby was taken into Great Ormond Street 3 weeks ago, suffering from pneumonia. He had been in a local hospital but failed to respond to treatment. The coroner was told that the baby was born in America, 14 weeks premature, and was very ill at birth. He developed heart complications and required multiple blood transfusions. He recovered well and thrived over the next year, but then he became progressively worse. At Great Ormond Street, doctors immediately suspected AIDS. The consultant paediatrician, Dr. Roland Levinsky, said in court, In the present state of our medical knowledge, there really isn't a treatment for this condition.
So this is the story of baby Antony Thorpe, who was the first child to die of AIDS in the UK after receiving infected blood in the United States, given he was born 14 weeks premature on the 6th of August 1983, while his British parents were over in America on a business trip. Press coverage of the inquest, held on the 12th of April 1985, appeared in all the newspapers here in the UK, along with those over in the United States. Now, the Daily Mirror on the 13th of April 1985, the day after the inquest, reported the story on the front page with the headline, "Sad Short Life of Baby Antony." And the article reads, "A tragic picture emerged yesterday of the short life of baby Antony Thorpe, who died of AIDS. Antony was born 3 months premature in August 1983 and weighed only 2 pounds. So many blood samples were taken to check Antony's condition that he needed 30 transfusions.
That is sad.
It was during one of these in America that Antony was given blood containing the deadly AIDS virus. Antony also suffered from a heart complaint and eventually went blind. The AIDS virus brought down his immunity to illness and he caught pneumonia. By the time he was admitted to London's Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children, it was too late. All Antony's heartbroken parents could do was watch their son die. They spent 3 weeks at his bedside until the end came this week. All blood in America is now tested for AIDS. Yesterday, a spokesman there said, 'It's terribly sad that this test had not been developed in time to save Antony.'"
And this would be the AIDS antibody test you mentioned in the Del Sinclair episode?
Well, when they say a spokesman there, I'm assuming there is America, especially as that's where Antony had received this blood.
Okay.
But you're right, in the Del Sinclair episode, we spoke about how John Cassidy and Michael Bedford had their blood screened with the AIDS antibody test that had come out in 1985. And through many other articles that I've seen and read, America and the UK were very much on the same page at the same time in regards to fighting the AIDS pandemic. So I'd imagine the test that had become available to screen blood for antibodies, AIDS antibodies here in the UK, would have been the same over in America as well.
And within the Daily Mirror, they continue the story under the headline, 3-week vigil of AIDS baby parents.
With the strapline, "Father weeps at the inquest."
Well, naturally. They've just lost their son.
Absolutely. And you can't even begin to imagine the pain that he's feeling having just lost his son. And in this article, there is a photograph of Antony's father, Gerald Thorpe, leaving the inquest at St Pancras Coroner's Court, followed by a priest who had attended to support and console him. And Gerald Thorpe has got his head bowed, and this image seems to be very much a kind of paparazzi-style photograph. And you have to say, did he need this after he's just heard the evidence and detail of his son's death at this inquest?
Good point.
However, the article goes on to say, "The parents of AIDS-deaf baby Antony Thorpe spent 3 weeks at his hospital bedside before he died. And all the time they were with him at London's Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, they knew that doctors could do nothing to save their son. Hospital Administrator Tim Walker, 28, said yesterday, the parents were given a room in the hospital so they could be near their baby. They were allowed to see him whenever it was possible. Parents of other children on the ward watched as heartbroken Gerald and Jennifer Thorpe kept a daily vigil at their son's bedside. One mother said, 'We saw the couple visit every day. They looked so sad, but at least they were able to be with him right up until the end. The doctors and the nurses were marvellous. There is such an atmosphere of hope on the ward. It's doubly sad when a kiddie is sentenced to death and there is nothing the doctors can do about it.' Antony, who was 20 months old, died on Wednesday, more than a year after he was given blood contaminated with AIDS in America. The virus breaks down the body's resistance to disease. Antony's father wept yesterday as a coroner recorded a verdict of misadventure on his son. The coroner heard how Antony, born 3 months prematurely, was given a blood transfusion in a Washington hospital. His father, who is British, was working in America at the time. 3 weeks ago, Antony was transferred from a Brighton hospital to Great Ormond Street Hospital, where he died from pneumonia. Dr. Roland Levinsky, who helped treat Antony, told the coroner there was no cure for AIDS. In time, he said, doctors hope to discover antiviral agents or vaccines to combat the disease. Until then, the only way to prevent this is to screen all blood products, and in time I hope this is what will happen. The coroner, Dr. Douglas Chambers, said, "I shall be sending a letter to the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Health saying it is my view that similar deaths ought to be prevented."
Yet still, all these decades on, those infected by HIV blood are still fighting for justice.
Yes, and isn't it mind-blowing that not only are they having to fight, but they're having to fight for such a long time? When we've seen with the recent post office scandal, the public outrage and calls for the truth and compensation to be sped up, yet there is not the same level of outrage or concern with the contaminated blood scandal.
That's an interesting point.
And with COVID-19 only a few years ago, there's a public inquiry. Yet, to my knowledge, I have found no evidence that there was ever an AIDS inquiry or a HIV/AIDS inquiry. It seems to me that HIV/AIDS was just merely swept under the carpet.
I agree.
And there is still, over 4 decades on, no memorial in London for lives lost to HIV and AIDS. And it took years and years of campaigning for a contaminated blood inquiry, but the fact that they had to campaign for that is fucking ludicrous. And eventually, one was announced in 2017, of which, coincidentally, the final report from that inquiry will be published in 2 days' time on the 20th of May, 2024. But why has it taken over 4 decades? It just blows my mind.
So what happened next?
Well, as I mentioned, the inquest into Antony's death made all the national and regional newspapers here in the UK and several newspapers in the United States. The New York Times concluded in one article, the Department of Health here said that chances of contracting AIDS through a normal blood transfusion are extremely remote. There have been about 130 reported cases of AIDS in Britain, as against more than 9,000 in the United States.
Wow.
And now I did manage to track down Antony's father, Jerry Thorpe, and he has continued to raise concerns and awareness over his son's death across his social media platforms.
I see his ex, formerly Twitter bio, states, father of first British baby to die from AIDS. Hashtag infected blood inquiry, hashtag life stories.
That's right. And Jerry has posted some of the newspaper headlines across his social media platforms from the time of his son's death. And some of the posts show his frustration at how this period of history, including the death of his son, has merely just disappeared. Because in September 2019, he writes on Twitter, the story from the mid-80s that disappeared from history.
And on August 8th, 2022, he wrote, even though my evidence is outside the inquiry I have today been threatened by the legal team for dissing the Department of Health and Social Care and Great Ormond Street Hospital.
And in this tweet or this thread, there's no indication as to what brought about this alleged threats of legal action from the government's own Department of Health and Social Care and allegedly Great Ormond Street Hospital. But when you look at Jerry's posts, you can see that he's just straight talking, and I like that. And I think as well from the tone, you can see there's an element of frustration in what he writes. But then who can blame him? Because like I've just said a few moments ago, he is a father of a child that died of AIDS through contaminated blood, albeit it was over in America. But he's going to have the same pain and want the same answers as everybody else who fought and campaigned for years and decades to get the government to eventually open an inquiry in 2017. So, who can blame him?
And in response to a tweet by the chief executive of Terrence Higgins Trust, Jerry shares his dismay at how the history of HIV/AIDS has been documented.
That's right, because chief executive of Terrence Higgins Trust, Richard Angle, responded to a tweet by THT about a book on HIV/AIDS from 1994, where on the 22nd of December 2021, he writes, I am reading this. It is remarkable, brilliantly written, and an important social history of AIDS and HIV in British. I think he means Britain. But anyhow.
Jerry responded, it's remarkable that no history of AIDS in the UK, including charities, has acknowledged my son's death in spite of the media attention at the time. No one can claim to have portrayed an accurate history without this.
Oh, but Jerry's got a point.
Yeah.
And myself as a gay man living with HIV, I know all too well that for as much as we say HIV/AIDS is not a gay disease, which was regurgitated by the media back in the 80s and it's still by some today, there does seem to be a focus on gay men and HIV/AIDS when it comes to the history of the virus. And I know gay men were disproportionately affected, but does that give us the right to merely ignore the fact that there was many of us affected by the virus? And I'm not for a second saying we should be competing with who was the first, but there does seem to be this righteousness and arrogance when it comes to playing the victim card around HIV and AIDS by certain gays and the alphabet and gender mafia, where I have witnessed in recent years individuals using AIDS and Section 28 to either push a political agenda or make incoherent arguments.
Yeah.
For example, and this is not just a one-off occurrence actually, I've seen it time and time again, but just the one that's at the top of my head from recently is 2 years ago, was when I was working in one of the London gay bars. We had a trans colleague that came storming into work one day, and she came around the bar and she was slamming stuff around. No hello, no kiss my ass, nothing. And she just went, oh, my trans rights have been revoked. And I thought, well, this is how we open a conversation these days with these young individuals, but okay. So I said, oh, how are your trans rights being revoked? And she started to just reel off this muddled story of the government were closing down a transgender clinic. And it was just by chance, the day before in the morning, I'd seen this story on the BBC News.
Okay.
So she gave me this story, which was obviously very much just a one-sided story in her head. And I said to her, but do you know the story? I said, because what I translated from the news reports, and I'm not entirely stupid, is that, yes, the government are closing down this transgender clinic because they've opened another one elsewhere, not far away from the original one, but they've opened another one with better care facilities because they feel it will better meet the needs of their patients. So this is not a revocation of rights. Surely this is a big tick that transgender people that will attend this clinic will get better care and in better care facilities. I said, so this is a good thing.
I thought that.
Because she knew she was losing the argument, she then just said, oh, well, it's all very reminiscent of Section 28. And I thought, well, I spent 13 years in education under Section 28 out of the 15 years it was on the statute books.
Yeah.
The average kid goes to 2 schools, a primary school and a secondary school. I went to 6 different schools, 7 if you want to split hairs, because I went to a local authority college as well. Not just up in Yorkshire, but geographically up in Yorkshire and down south in London, so 2 very different geographical locations. And Section 28 clearly had no fucking effect on me whatsoever. I actually quite enjoyed my education under Section 28 because I learned how to read, write, add up, how to converse with people without losing my shit. Generally had a good time at school, loved it. And I said to her, well, okay, then explain to me how Section 28 is linked with this story. It doesn't make any sense because the law does state that Section 28 was the prohibit of promotion of homosexuality, nothing to do with transgenderism. I said, but as soon as you're jumping on the bandwagon, tell me. She couldn't tell me. So then what would we do? And it always happens, it's a classic case. It always seems to go in this kind of tiering system where she then moved from Section 28 to the AIDS pandemic. Well, let's not forget the AIDS pandemic. And she didn't know that I was living with HIV. So I went, well, okay, then tell me about the AIDS pandemic. Oh, well, all the gay men that lost their lives. And I just was like, is that it? Is that your knowledge of the AIDS pandemic? And I said to her, can you name one person that you know that died of HIV AIDS? And I just got the standard response. Freddie Mercury and Princess Diana. Well, no, Princess Diana didn't die of AIDS. She did a lot of work for AIDS charities, obviously, and raising awareness. That we can't think of. But no, Princess Diana didn't have AIDS and she didn't die of AIDS, darling. But there you go. So, I see this time and time again. They merely just pluck these buzzwords and phrases that they've no doubt heard bandied around by the likes of Pink News, that's run by the same kind of people. And they use these buzzwords and phrases like weapons to try and win an argument. But sadly, if you don't know your history or can't be bothered to learn it, then you have to be prepared for someone to turn your own weapon on you, which makes you look like a complete cunt. And what is both ironic and moronic is that as a gay man, and I've seen it time and time before with many gay men, that share the facts of our lived history, you get silenced by being called just transphobic.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, are gay rights and what were fought for and won no longer human rights because you're no longer able to voice an opinion?
Well said.
So when it comes to HIV/AIDS history and the fact that many of these young individuals now that will weaponize it and use it as a weapon don't know the history and the individual stories and haven't lived through it, then I can very much see Jerry's point of view. So I am with Jerry on this one, and from his tweets, I was keen to speak to him.
Did you manage to speak to Gerald Thorpe?
Well, I did reach out to Jerry Thorpe on several of his social media platforms, but sadly I haven't heard back. I do note that his social media abruptly ends in April 2023. There's no more public posting or communication, so hopefully, if he can, he'll drop us a line.
Still, there is no escaping that history documents that sadly, 1-year-old Anthony John Thorpe lost his life to this horrible disease in April 1985.
Oh, incredibly sad. And there is a cute photograph of little Anthony Thorpe on our blog post. The link is in the show notes.
This final story from 1987 perhaps also shows why the parents of 10-year-old Stephen Quirk, who died of AIDS, felt compelled to share his story.
Yes, this is the story of 10-year-old Stephen Quirk, whose mother Eileen spoke to the Daily Mirror on the 2nd of February 1987. Now, this story is split into two. So we have first the headline on the front page, which is "Boy 10 Dies of AIDS," and there's a photograph inset of Stephen in his school uniform, which I believe later in the article is confirmed to have only been taken a matter of weeks before he passed away. The full-page article has the headline, "Tormented Mum's Prayer for AIDS Boy," and "Please don't ever wake up, my darling," with the strapline, "She couldn't bear to see his suffering." And the article reads, "Heartbroken, Eileen Quirk saw her 10-year-old son destroyed by AIDS, and when he slipped into a coma, she prayed for the end. Red-eyed from lack of sleep, she bent over young Stephen's wasted form and whispered, 'Please don't ever wake up, darling.' 5 days later, Stephen was dead. He was the first haemophiliac youngster to die of AIDS in Britain, and his grieving parents decided that his story should be told. 'We want everyone to know AIDS isn't a gay plague,' Eileen said. 'My son wasn't promiscuous. He wasn't a junkie. Stephen was an innocent lad of 10. I didn't want him to die, but I didn't want him to come out of the coma.'"
As with the previous story, these parents, despite their grief, share their stories to give the public and the media a massive wake-up call.
Yeah, and I think in a way Eileen is calling out the media by stating the obvious. AIDS is not a, to quote the media, gay plague. And that her 10-year-old son, Stephen, does not in any way subscribe to the labels pushed by the press. And Eileen, in a way, is re-educating the public by sharing Stephen's story, and she's giving the readers a different narrative for the transmission of AIDS. And the article continues, "I didn't want him to wake up to the awful stigma of being an AIDS victim. It would have been too horrible for him not to have anyone to play with because his pals were frightened to come round. The thought of him becoming some sort of leper was too awful to think about. Stephen's short life had been blighted by haemophilia, the disease that means even a minor wound can cause fatal bleeding. Eileen and her husband Billy padded his cot when he was a baby in case he banged his head. Yet the pair vowed not to wrap him in cotton wool. He climbed trees and joined the rough and tumble of other lads. Stephen was having injections of a blood product called Factor 8. He received a supply contaminated with the AIDS virus. And just before last Christmas, the nightmare began. He was taken to Gwenwyd Hospital at Bangor, North Wales, with a throat infection. Tests showed that he could have AIDS. 5 days later, on December the 8th, Stephen started to show AIDS symptoms."
Can we just take 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure, let's take a break. So you okay to continue?
Yes, I just needed 5 minutes to recompose myself.
Good, as long as you're okay to continue.
None of these stories are easy, especially when they involve children.
And I know some of these stories are difficult to listen to and are emotional, especially when they involve children. But as Gerald Thorpe, the father of 1-year-old Antony, alluded to in the previous story, these are individual stories that should be documented. They form the fabric of the history of HIV and AIDS. And obviously we would much prefer to remember these individuals as individuals and not because of the virus. But the fact remains that HIV/AIDS did not just go around attacking famous or well-known people. Freddie Mercury, Liberace, Rock Hudson, which are probably names that anybody who's asked about the history of HIV/AIDS would probably roll off the tongue. When at the heart of it, there was more lives lost of individuals like the ones that we've been discussing. And I do feel that these individuals and their accounts in HIV history shouldn't just lay forever dormant in the dark, dank newspaper archives.
I agree.
And at this point, I should say that Eileen, Stephen's mother, does continue in the article to give an account of Stephen's time in hospital that some listeners may find upsetting. The article continues. 5 days later, on December the 8th, Stephen started to show AIDS symptoms. Eileen said, "His doctor was devastated. I caught him saying a little prayer for Stephen. I spotted several nurses having a quiet weep. My son was in such pain from injections of the drugs, I begged them not to let him suffer. But he was so brave, I never heard him complain once. His condition deteriorated all the time. His fingers started to go blue, and his ankles began to swell from heart failure. His chest sounded like an old run-down washing machine. He was making an awful wheezing noise. He couldn't eat or drink. He was wasting away. His little body had gone haywire. On December the 14th, Stephen went into a coma. Billy was sure he would come out of it, said Eileen. He kept saying, "Come on, son, open your eyes." I hoped that he wouldn't. By this time, Stephen had full-blown AIDS. His veins collapsed. We sat by his bed night and day. Sometimes there were little movements of his hands, tiny flickers on his face, but he didn't wake. Stephen died on December 19th, 1987. Mourners at the cremation included doctors, nurses and ambulance men. His Christmas presents lay unopened. Now at their home outside Colwyn Bay, Eileen and Billy are trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. A school photo of a bright, healthy lad taken just 6 weeks ago is a painful reminder. So are the drawings Stephen did before going into hospital. I still go to the window at the same time every day to watch him coming home from school, his mother said. I can't help it. The couple have told their 4-year-old daughter, Jennifer, that Stephen has gone to heaven. He loved her so much, Eileen said. He got 50p a week pocket money and always gave her half.
Ah, Stephen, what a kind and thoughtful big brother.
I know, right? And the article concludes, Billy has written a country and western ballad which he hopes to get recorded in memory of his son. It's called Tell Me a Story, Daddy.
And was this the end of Stephen's story?
In short, no, because naturally Stephen's story made several of the national and various local and regional newspapers given, as they say Stephen was the first haemophiliac child to die as a result of AIDS, and both Stephen's parents appeared in articles in the months that followed.
Okay.
Now, Stephen's mother Eileen appeared in both the Daily Mirror and the Daily Record, where she slammed not only the UK government's slow response to the AIDS pandemic, but the government's messaging at the time through its 1987 AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance campaign. Now, in addition to the article we just read from the Daily Mirror, the Daily Record added, they, Stephen's parents, felt a burning anger and resentment last week when the government's Don't Die of Ignorance leaflet dropped through the letterbox of their home outside Colwyn Bay, Wales. It was aimed at gays and drug addicts, not innocent haemophiliacs like my son Stephen, said Eileen. We want everyone to know AIDS isn't an exclusive gay plague. Our son didn't go whoring around, he wasn't promiscuous, he wasn't a junkie. Stephen was an innocent lad of 10. And then, under the headline, Sad Mum Slams AIDS Campaign, the Daily Mirror article reported, the heartbroken mother of 10-year-old AIDS victim Stephen Quirk yesterday slammed the government's campaign against the disease as a waste of money. Eileen Quirk, whose son was Britain's youngest haemophiliac to die from AIDS, said, it's aimed exclusively at homosexuals, lesbians and drug addicts. There's no warning to haemophiliacs and no warning about the horrific symptoms. The leaflets are hardly worth the paper they're printed on. The government should have done something a long time ago, but they have left it too late. I feel very bitter. I mean, the lesbians aside, I'm kind of inclined to agree with what she's saying. It was far too late.
Yeah.
They were slow to react. The leaflet and the television campaign very much was, targeting homoerotica in the way that it was shot. It didn't highlight the risk with haemophiliacs, but then you have to ask, is the government really going to put out a leaflet saying haemophiliacs are at risk of transmission because we, the government, are giving out infected blood? So it's kind of a hard one, but on a whole, I do agree with what she's saying.
And in the Liverpool Daily Post on November 7th, 1987, we hear from Stephen's father, William Quirk.
Under the headline, Father Welcome AIDS Payout, the article reads, the father of Britain's only child haemophiliac to have died after receiving blood containing the AIDS virus, last night praised the government's move to give £10 million in compensation to victims. Mr. William Quirk, whose 10-year-old son Stephen died in Gwynedd, Bangor in December of last year, said it was right the government should be helping those haemophiliacs who receive contaminated blood. Mr. Quirk, who lives at Mill Cottage in the Conwy Valley, called at the time of his son's death last year for compensation to be paid to haemophiliacs who had received the AIDS virus from blood products. And yesterday in the Commons it was announced that haemophiliacs who contracted AIDS from blood products prescribed by the NHS will share £10 million compensation. The Haemophilia Society, which has been supported by backbench MPs in its campaign for compensation, said it would set up a trust fund to distribute the cash on behalf of the estimated 1,200 victims. And while no doubt continuing to mourn the loss of their son Stephen, parents Eileen and Billy Quirk continued to share Stephen's story to not only raise awareness of the contaminated blood scandal, but to ensure those still affected were able to continue their fight in receiving justice. Sadly, Eileen and Billy Quirk didn't get to witness the announcement of 2017 that there was to be a blood scandal inquiry. Eileen Quirk passed away on the 5th of July 2012, aged 65, and William Billy Quirk passed away on the 4th of July 2016, aged 73.
All of the actual newspaper articles mentioned in this serving are available on the Extra Tea blog. You can find the link below in the show notes. If you've enjoyed listening to AIDS, The Lost Voices, then don't be a shady bitch and show us some love with
A big fat like,
a comment,
a share, as in the link, not as in, do you believe in life after love? Oh.
and for fuck's sake, don't forget to
subscribe and follow.